إيقاف التسجيل زر إيقاف فويس أوفر.
Hi Gideon, thank you for coming again. This time we are going to speak about the wider aspects of change after the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. So what did happen? This is your area of expertise.
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to understand we're speaking about two different scales. There is the large one, the long way, which is much larger than ever thought. We're speaking between the 6th century, the height of the Byzantine rule, and the 11th century.
Pre-Islamic to medieval period.
The medieval period. Within this very long period, we have episodes, and we have very short events. Wars, earthquake, these calamities that leave substantial marks on the archaeological record. This is what archaeologists love the most.
This is what we see here?
This is exactly what you see here. So basically we're speaking about the Muslim conquest, 636, 638, which affected Jerusalem, which goes with fire, destruction, demolition of buildings. And when you come as an archaeologist to trace these signs in this specific location, for example, and we do have destructions here, nothing of the kind occurred in this period. I mean, not a single building was destroyed during the Islamic conquest, not only in Jerusalem. We have hundreds of excavations all over the southern Levant, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine. No destruction whatsoever. So this is for the war, the most important war. Then you go to earthquakes. Of course, there is an earthquake destruction. You go to Beit Shan, you go to Pella, you go to Jarash, you go even in Jerusalem, you look behind us at these ruins. The evidence of the earthquake, the 749 earthquake, which was one of the most severe events. But when you incorporate these two elements, the long durée and the episode, you see a very clear pattern of continuity, which means that basically the land was changing, but very, very gradually. When you're visiting Jerusalem, let's say around the year 600, and then again around the year 800, you could see changes. You could see the new palaces, you could see the Haram al-Sharif, but basically the city kept its Byzantine, I would say, atmosphere. The same goes for Tiberias and Caesarea. They were contracting, they were changing, but they were still dominating Christian cities. Now, at the other hand, you have new innovation. New cities are created. You look to at Ramle of today. Unfortunately, most of the early Islamic city is not existing anymore because it was completely looted in medieval period. But this was the largest center of urbanism, of administration in Palestine, communicating very extensively with Fustat in Egypt in one hand, Damascus in Syria in the other hand. The road networks we were speaking about developed already in the Umayyad period, and a very extensive network of communication.
The examples you gave us are about changes in the urban settlements. What did happen in the rural countryside?
Well, basically, more of the same, which means that the rural countryside of the Byzantine period continued, very gradually decline, in contrast to the picture you might imagine about the invasion, replacement of the population. The population was not replaced. There was a very gradual penetration of new Islamic elements into the existing population. So again, if you come to a village, let's say around the year 600, you come again around the year 800, you could see changes, but basically the village remains more or less the same. Division between Jewish and Christian villages, continuity of both churches and mosques. We even have inscriptions within synagogues written in Greek, but according to the new administrative system of the Hijra. The years are mentioning in the Hijra. If you go to the fringe of the desert, so the village of Nisana, there's a very famous archive of papyri that was discovered over there. There's a change in language, quite a quick one. By the end of the 7th century, you see the introduction of Arabic. But at the same time, Greek is continued to be used. The language of administration changes, but the daily life of the villagers, be it in the Galilee, in the Judean lowlands, or in the Negev, practically was left unchanged until, there's a question until when, but definitely not before the 9th century. So I'm speaking about accelerating changes from the 9th until the 11th century.
So you are describing a very slow but continuous transition.
Yes.
So why did it become a quick one in the 9th and 10th centuries?
Well, something happened with the Fatimid rule, and something much more dramatically, we believe today, happened around the mid-11th century. When you look only at the archaeological record, you look at Tiberias, you look at Ramle, you look at Fustat, you look at Antioch in northern Syria, very quick decline, abandonment. So the urban centers were much declined and even completely abandoned around the mid-11th centuries before the Crusader conquest. The Crusaders shouldn't be blamed about this one, maybe about many other things in the history of this country, but not about this one. So the abandonment and the sharp decline of settlements, both in the urban sphere and in the rural communities, occurred sometimes within the 11th century. Why and how it happened is still, this is the next thing to be explored.
This is what you call arguments in stone. Do we have collaboration from other kinds of sources?
Well, we wish we could have an eyewitness. You know, when you look at Roman Jerusalem, we have this historian, Josephus Flavius. When you excavate Roman Jerusalem, you follow the footsteps of Flavius. Unfortunately, we don't have a very reliable eyewitness for the Muslim conquest. We do have for the 11th and 10th century, Muqaddasi, Nasir Hosso, other travelers, but we don't have for the time of the conquest. The history of the conquest was crystallized 300 years later, as we know. And this is where what I call the arguments in stone and the very interesting combination between the historical studies and archaeology. I remember one of the most famous scholars of Islamic history, Patricia Crone. The late Patricia Crone. She published she and Michael Cook published maybe the most controversial book on the early Islamic history, Hagarism. And the years later, in conferences here and abroad we met, and she was telling me, listen, you archaeologists have to go and dig these periods because we are somehow in a state of loss. We need some good evidence. And these are the arguments of stones, the arguments of the landscape, the changing of the landscapes. We were speaking about the new innovation, introduction of technologies, of artistic representation, of architectural elements. This is what makes the big story and the long duress story much more visible and I would say even much more accurate when speaking about this period.
Was there a typical settlement, a typical Muslim settlement, a rural or urban settlement at that period? Something that we could identify, okay, this is it, this is a Muslim city, this is a Muslim village.
Well, there are new innovations. The city of Ramle is completely different from the nearby city of Lod Diospolis, a Roman Byzantine city. The Umayyad palaces, of course, completely new innovation in the landscape of the country. But speaking as a whole, when you are just wandering around, both in the urban and the rural communities, you couldn't feel this change because basically the population didn't change dramatically. Even the process of conversion was very slow and gradual, as we can see from the evidence of churches that are still being used as late as the 9th and 10th century, with all the Christian rituals within it. You can see it all over the country. So if you ask the question about was there a Muslim city in these places, there are new Islamic elements. But maybe this is another myth that has to be changed. This colonial aspects, or I would say the early 20th century aspect of the Muslim city. Maybe it fits for the later medieval periods, but not for the early stages of the Islamic world.
So this is the dialogue between the continuity in population and a continuity in the physical aspects of landscape. You can't divide, you can't separate between the two.
You can incorporate these two aspects together, looking at what happened to settlements, and we have now a much more refined view of pottery assemblages, glass assemblages, coins, which not all the time give you the whole picture, but we can tell today much more reliably than we could do 30 years ago about sequences. And then we come to a site, we can say much more clearly, or we can show much more clearly the continuity of the basic daily aspects of life, like pottery, glass, coins, metals, which is another incredible story, the developments of capability of metallurgy, of production and consumption, of course, of beautifully produced metal vessels, which were much, much more accelerated within the early Islamic period.
And you've mentioned that something happened in the middle of the 11th century. What happened?
Yes, if we want to put the finger now on the point of change, archaeologically speaking, we have to go to the mid-11th century. There is a very now wide picture of decline, rapid decline, abandonment. Large cities were completely deserted. You go to Amle, nothing goes beyond the mid-11th century. The same picture in Tiberias. Also in Jerusalem, you can see this in hoards of jewelry, of coins, of metals. The largest hoards ever discovered in this part of the world are from the 11th century.
Before the Crusades?
Before the Crusade, definitely. This goes to the mid-11th century. The Crusaders cannot be blamed for these things in the history of this country.
Thank you very much, Gideon. This was very illuminating. Thank you again.
Thank you.